Picture a cramped workshop in Hartford, Connecticut, where the air hangs thick with machine oil and metal shavings. It's 1857, and a 24-year-old machinist named Christopher Spencer has been working 16-hour days for months on something the established gunmakers are calling impossible, a repeating rifle. Not just any repeating rifle, but one that actually works. One that won't jam after 3 shots, won't misfire in the rain, won't blow up in a soldier's face. The older craftsmen at the Cheney Brothers silk mill where Spencer works by day shake their heads at this farm boy who thinks he can revolutionize 3 centuries of firearms design. That mad tinkerer, they call him. That dreamer wasting his nights on pipe dreams while real men sleep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what makes Spencer different from every other ambitious young machinist in New England. He's not guessing. He's not tinkering randomly. This is a man who taught himself mechanical engineering by dismantling every clock he could get his hands on as a child, studying how springs and gears work together, understanding that reliable machinery requires perfect harmony between dozens of moving parts. And now he's applying that same methodical genius to the oldest military problem in warfare. How do you put more bullets downrange faster than the enemy? Think about what warfare looked like in 1857. A trained soldier with a muzzle-loading musket could fire maybe 3 shots per minute if he was good and didn't panic. Loading a musket required 12 separate steps. Tear open the paper cartridge with your teeth, pour powder down the barrel, drop in the lead ball, ram it home with the ramrod, prime the pan, cock the hammer, aim, fire, and then start all over again while the enemy is doing the parter. Exact same thing back at you. It's a dance that's been performed on battlefields since the invention of gunpowder, and everyone just accepts it as the natural order of warfare. Spencer sees something different. He sees waste. Wasted motion, wasted time, wasted lives. Every second a soldier spends reloading is a second he can't be firing, can't be taking cover, can't be surviving. What if you could preload your ammunition? What if instead of loading 1 shot at a time, you loaded 7 shots at once and then just kept firing? The mechanical challenge seems insurmountable. You need a magazine to hold the cartridges, a feeding mechanism to move them into position, an extraction system to remove spent casings, a firing mechanism that won't jam when residue builds up, and all of it has to work every single time because soldiers can't stop in the middle of battle to disassemble and clean their rifles. The breakthrough comes with the cartridge itself. Spencer designs a copper rimfire cartridge that's completely waterproof. Think about what that means. For the first time in history, a soldier could drop his ammunition in a river, fish it out, and fire it without hesitation. The copper casing contains everything, powder and bullet in one neat package, and when the firing pin strikes the rim, the whole thing ignites reliably every time. But the real genius is in how Spencer feeds these cartridges into the chamber. He puts a tube magazine through the buttstock of the rifle. 7 cartridges stacked one behind the other, held under spring pressure. When you work the lever, it extracts the spent casing, ejects it, and chambers a fresh round in one smooth motion. 7 shots. You could fire 7 aimed shots in the time it took a traditional soldier to fire one. In 1860, Spencer finally has a working prototype. He takes it to the War Department, and this is where the story gets interesting in ways that'll echo through the rest of our tale. The officials watch. Spencer fires 7 shots in 10 seconds. They see him reload the tube magazine in under 20 seconds. They watch him dunk the rifle in a water barrel and fire it immediately afterward without misfiring. And you know what they do? They thank him for his time and show him the door. The official reason is that repeating rifles would cause soldiers to waste ammunition. The unofficial reason is that the Ordnance Department has contracts with existing manufacturers, arsenals full of traditional muskets, and careers built on maintaining the status quo. Innovation threatens all of that. But Spencer is persistent in a way that borders on obsessive. He gets his rifle into the hands of individual officers who buy them with their own money. He demonstrates it at state militias. He writes letters to anyone who'll read them. And then, in 1861, the Civil War explodes and suddenly everyone needs weapons desperately. The Navy orders 700 Spencer rifles. Then the Army orders 12,000 more. Not because the generals suddenly believe in the design, but because they're hemorrhaging men and they'll try anything. The moment that changes, everything happens in 1863. President Abraham Lincoln himself agrees to test the rifle. Picture this scene. The President of the United States walks onto the White House lawn carrying Spencer's rifle. Army officers stand around uncomfortably because they've been fighting Spencer's adoption for 2 years, and now their commander-in-chief is about to demonstrate exactly what they've been rejecting. Lincoln loads the tube magazine. He shoulders the rifle, and he fires 7 shots in rapid succession at a target board. Crack, 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 crack. The President turns to the assembled officers with that rifle still smoking in his hands and says one word: magnificent. But even Lincoln's endorsement can't overcome institutional resistance completely. The Ordnance Department slow walks production. They raise objections about ammunition supply. They question reliability even as field reports pour in praising the Spencer. They're protecting something, though it's not clear if it's their careers, their contracts, or simply their egos. What is clear is that tens of thousands of Union soldiers are heading into battle with single-shot muskets when they could have repeating rifles, and that choice is being made in Washington offices by men who'll never hear a shot fired in anger. Spencer doesn't know it yet, but his rifle is about to prove itself in ways that'll make it legendary. And the bureaucrats who fought its adoption? They're about to have blood on their hands in ways they can't imagine. Because 13 years after Lincoln fired that rifle on the White House lawn, American soldiers are going to die in Montana with single-shot carbines while their enemies fire repeating rifles. And when we calculate the cost of bureaucratic obstinacy, we're going to be counting bodies. The first soldiers to carry Spencer rifles into combat treat them like something between a miracle and a dangerous secret. There's this letter from a Union private named William Cook to his mother in the summer of 1863 that captures the almost mystical relationship these men develop with their weapons. He writes, "Mother, I have named my Spencer Salvation because she has saved my life 3 times now at Gettysburg. The rebels come on thinking we are spent after our first volley, and then Salvation speaks 6 more times." This isn't romantic exaggeration. This is a soldier who understands that the chunk of metal and wood in his hands represents the difference between going home and being buried in a mass grave. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The Spencer doesn't just give individual soldiers an advantage. It fundamentally changes battlefield mathematics in ways that commanders are still trying to understand. At the Battle of Hoover's Gap in Tennessee, June 24th, 1863, Colonel John Wilder commands a brigade of mounted infantry, 4 regiments, about 2,000 men total. And Wilder has a problem. He's supposed to hold this gap against a Confederate division that outnumbers him at least 7-1. Standard military doctrine says this is impossible. You can't hold ground when you're outnumbered 7-1 unless you have earthworks, artillery support, and reinforcements nearby. Wilder has none of these things. What Wilder does have is Spencer rifles. And here's where this man shows the kind of leadership that makes you wish you could go back in time and shake his hand. The Army won't issue Spencer repeaters to his brigade. Too expensive, the Ordnance Department says. Unreliable, they claim, despite field reports proving otherwise. So Wilder does something extraordinary. He convinces his men to mortgage their own farms and buy Spencer rifles with their own money. Think about that for a second. These farmers and shopkeepers from Indiana and Illinois are putting up their land, their homes, their families' futures, to buy weapons the United States Army won't provide. That's not just confidence in the technology. That's desperation born from experience. These men have seen their friends die because they couldn't reload fast enough. At Hoover's Gap, those mortgaged farms pay dividends in Confederate blood. Wilder's brigade takes position in the gap and waits. When the Confederate division advances, they expect to face the usual pattern: a volley from the Union line, a pause while the Yankees reload, then rush forward before they can fire again. That's how infantry combat has worked for generations. But Wilder's men fire their first volley, and then immediately fire a second, and a third, and fourth. They're pouring out sustained fire at a rate the Confederates have never experienced. The attacking division staggers, regroups, and comes on again. Same result. The Spencers just keep firing. By the end of the day, Wilder's 2,000 men have held the gap against 15,000 Confederates, and the Confederate commander reports to his superiors that he faced an entire Union corps of at least 20,000 men. He's not lying or exaggerating. He literally cannot believe that 2,000 men could generate that much firepower. The mathematics of warfare just changed, and most of the generals on both sides don't understand it yet. The Confederates figure it out fast, though. There's a captured Confederate letter from after the Battle of Chickamauga that's been preserved in the National Archives, and the fear in it is palpable. A Georgia private writes home, "We call them the Yankee 7-shooters, and when we see a regiment carrying them, we know we are in for a hard day. They load on Sunday and shoot all week, or so it seems. You cannot rush them because they never stop firing. It is like walking into a hailstorm of lead." Confederate soldiers start calling units equipped with Spencers the Lightning Brigade, not out of respect, but out of terror. And they start trying to capture Spencer rifles whenever possible, because their own single-shot Enfields are suddenly obsolete. Here's the tragedy within the triumph. While soldiers in the field are screaming for more Spencer rifles, while unit commanders are sending report after report documenting their effectiveness, while Confederate generals are changing tactics specifically to avoid Spencer-equipped units, the United States Ordnance Department is actively sabotaging broader adoption. And we know exactly why, because the correspondence has survived. The Chief of Ordnance, a man named James Ripley, writes in 1863 that repeating rifles would lead soldiers to waste ammunition and that the increased weight of carrying extra cartridges would tire them out. On the surface, these sound like legitimate tactical concerns. But dig deeper, and you find something uglier. The Ordnance Department has warehouses full of traditional muzzle-loading rifles. They have contracts with manufacturers producing those rifles. They have an entire supply chain built around paper cartridges and loose powder and lead balls. The Spencer rifle requires metallic cartridges, a completely different manufacturing process, new supply lines, new training protocols. It threatens to make obsolete not just the weapons but the entire institutional structure built around those weapons. So men like Ripley, who've built their careers on that structure, fight innovation with every bureaucratic tool available. They slow-walk contracts. They question test results. They require additional demonstrations. They form committees to study the issue. And while they're protecting their careers and their arsenals, soldiers are dying. By 1864, enough Spencers have reached the battlefield that their reputation is established. The 7th Illinois Cavalry, the 5th Michigan Cavalry, the 17th Indiana Mounted Infantry, all equipped with Spencers, are earning reputations as elite units, not because the men are braver or better trained, but because they're carrying weapons that let them fight at 3 to 7 times the effectiveness of traditionally armed soldiers. And still, the majority of Union soldiers are carrying single-shot rifles. The math is brutal and simple. The government could equip every soldier with a Spencer for an additional $40 per rifle. $40. In a war that's costing millions per day, $40 per soldier is a rounding error. But the Ordnance Department refuses. And that $40 saved equals how many soldiers dead. We'll get to that calculation soon, and the answer will make you sick. Christopher Spencer watches all of this from his Connecticut workshop. He's producing rifles as fast as he can, but he's constantly fighting for contracts, fighting for payment, fighting against bureaucratic resistance. He's winning on the battlefield and losing in Washington. And that pattern, that tension between field effectiveness and institutional obstinacy, is setting up a tragedy that'll haunt American military history. Because the Civil War is going to end, the Spencer rifle is going to be declared surplus, the Army is going to adopt a different weapon system, and 13 years later, American soldiers are going to die in Montana carrying single-shot carbines while facing enemies with repeating rifles. The enemies will be using Winchesters and Henrys, but they could have been facing Spencers, and the difference will be measured in coffins. June 25, 1876. The Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. If you want to understand how bureaucratic penny pinching translates directly into dead soldiers, this is your case study. This is where everything we've been talking about converges into one of the most infamous disasters in American military history. And the truly maddening thing is that almost everyone involved could see it coming. Let's set the stage. The Civil War ended 11 years ago. The Spencer Repeating Rifle Company, despite its battlefield success, has been driven into bankruptcy through a combination of political manipulation and economic pressure from competitors. The Army, looking to cut costs during peacetime, has adopted the Springfield Model 1873 single-shot carbine. It's a good rifle by the standards of traditional firearms. Reliable, accurate, well-made. It fires one shot, then you open the breech, extract the spent cartridge, load a new one, close the breech, cock the hammer, and fire again. In the hands of a trained soldier, you can get off maybe one shot every 4 seconds if you're good and not panicking. That's 15 shots per minute if everything goes perfectly. Now here's the kicker. The Spencer rifle that bureaucrats rejected as too expensive costs $60. The Springfield carbine costs $20. The government is saving $40 per rifle by issuing Springfields instead of Spencers or the newer Winchester repeaters. $40. Remember that number because we're going to calculate its cost in human lives very precisely. Meanwhile, out on the Great Plains, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors are acquiring Winchester and Henry, repeating rifles through trade and through capture from Army supply trains. These aren't primitive weapons. The Winchester Model 1873 can fire 15 shots before reloading. The older Henry rifles can fire 16. And here's the beautiful irony that should make every military procurement officer lose sleep. The United States government is sending soldiers armed with single-shot rifles to fight native warriors armed with repeating rifles. We've literally reversed the technological advantage that won the Civil War. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer commands the 7th Cavalry, and Custer is a complicated figure. Brilliant cavalry commander during the Civil War, youngest general in the Union Army, personally brave to the point of recklessness. But he's also glory-hungry, politically ambitious, and contemptuous of Native American fighting ability in ways that are going to prove fatal. On the morning of June 25th, Custer's scouts tell him they've found the largest concentration of Lakota and Cheyenne they've ever seen. Thousands of warriors. Thousands. The scouts, who are Crow and Arikara and know exactly what they're looking at, tell Custer to wait for reinforcements. Custer ignores them. He's offered Gatling guns, early machine guns that could provide devastating, suppressive fire. He refuses them as too cumbersome, too slow. He divides his force into 3 battalions, a classic cavalry tactic that works brilliantly when you're facing an enemy that'll run from aggressive action. Except these warriors aren't running. They're defending their families, their territory, their way of life. And they have better weapons than Custer's men. Custer takes 5 companies, about 210 men, and rides toward the village. The other battalions are supposed to support him, but the terrain and timing go wrong. Custer finds himself on a ridge, overlooking the Little Bighorn, with his 210 men facing somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. And this is where the mathematics of firepower become a death sentence. Custer's men have Springfield single-shot carbines, 1 shot every 4 seconds in ideal conditions. But these aren't ideal conditions. The Springfield carbine has a design flaw. When the copper cartridge casing heats up from repeated firing, it expands. And when you try to extract an expanded copper casing from a hot breech, it sticks. It jams. You have to pry it out with a knife or a ramrod. We know this happened because archaeologists have found knives with copper residue and bent ramrods at the battlefield. Soldiers were frantically trying to clear jammed rifles while taking fire. The warriors attacking them have Winchester and Henry repeaters. They can fire 3 shots per second, sustained. Do the math. A soldier with a Springfield fires 1 shot. In the time it takes him to reload, a warrior with a Winchester fires 12 shots. If the Springfield jams, which they frequently did when the barrel heated up, that soldier is trying to clear his weapon while bullets are hitting all around him. It's not even a fair fight. It's an execution. Private Peter Thompson, one of the few survivors because he got separated from Custer's immediate command, later testified about what he saw. Men throwing away their useless rifles and fighting with knives and pistols. Soldiers trying to dig rifle pits with their hands because they couldn't generate enough return fire to keep the warriors at a distance. The sound, he said, was what haunted him. Not the gunfire from the warriors, but the silence from the cavalry positions. The Springfields would fire a ragged volley, then long pauses as men struggled to reload or clear jams, while the repeaters kept up a constant roar. The battle lasts less than an hour. 268 men die, not just Custer, but every single soldier in his immediate battalion. When reinforcements finally arrive the next day, they find the bodies stripped and mutilated according to the warriors' traditions. But they also find something that tells the technical story: spent cartridge casings. Thousands of them. The archaeologists who've studied the battlefield in modern times using metal detectors can track the movements of individual warriors by their cartridge casings. They find clusters of Winchester and Henry casings in positions overlooking the cavalry. They find scattered Springfield casings, often with extractor marks showing the soldiers were struggling with jammed rounds. Here's the counterfactual that keeps military historians up at night. What if Custer's men had Spencer repeaters? Or Winchesters? What if they could fire 7 shots before reloading instead of 1? The basic tactics don't change. Custer is still outnumbered at least 5-1, still surrounded, still cut off from support, but with repeating rifles, his men could have maintained a defensive perimeter. They could have generated enough suppressive fire to prevent the warriors from advancing as freely. They could have conducted a fighting withdrawal toward the other battalions. Most of them probably still would have died because Custer made catastrophic tactical decisions. But most is different from all. With repeating rifles, we're probably talking about 50% casualties instead of 100%. That's 130 soldiers who could have survived, and the cost to provide those repeating rifles. $40 per weapon times 200, 68 men equals $10,720. The United States government saved $10,720 by issuing Springfields instead of repeaters. That savings cost 268 lives. Each life was valued by the procurement system at exactly $40. If you want to understand how bureaucratic decisions kill soldiers, there's your equation written in blood on a Montana hillside. The warriors who fought at Little Bighorn weren't primitive savages armed with bows and arrows, which is how they were portrayed in American newspapers. They were sophisticated military forces using combined arms tactics and superior weapons. The 7th Cavalry wasn't defeated by numbers alone. They were defeated by the same bureaucratic dysfunction that had hampered the Union Army during the Civil War, the same institutional resistance to innovation that Christopher Spencer fought his entire career. 15 years after Spencer's proved their worth at Chickamauga, American soldiers died because the institution chose tradition and cost savings over effectiveness. And here's what makes it even worse. After Little Bighorn, after the public outrage, after the congressional hearings, the Army finally adopts repeating rifles for general issue. The disaster forces the change that Spencer begged for, that field commanders demanded, that common sense required. But it's too late for the men on Last Stand Hill. Their brass Springfield casings, scattered across the Montana grass, became archaeological evidence of American military procurement failure. The aftermath of Little Bighorn reads like a textbook case of how institutions respond to catastrophic failure. First comes denial, then blame shifting, then rushed reforms that address symptoms while ignoring root causes. And finally, the collective amnesia that ensures the same mistakes get repeated with different weapons in different wars. Public outrage forces immediate change. Within months of the disaster, the Army begins issuing repeating rifles to cavalry units. The Springfield trapdoor single shots that, jammed on Last Stand Hill, get relegated to rear echelon troops and eventually to storage. It's the reform that field commanders begged for, that Christopher Spencer fought for his entire career, that common sense demanded 15 years earlier. But it comes too late for 268 men, and the institutional memory that could prevent future disasters never quite forms. Christopher Spencer watches these developments from an increasingly marginalized position. His company went bankrupt in 1869, absorbed by a competitor who wanted his patents more than his principles. That competitor was the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, owned by Oliver Winchester, a man who understood politics and industrial manipulation far better than he understood innovation. Winchester had spent years using political connections to secure government contracts while simultaneously using industrial espionage to steal Spencer's designs. The bitter irony is that Winchester rifles, which finally get adopted after Little Bighorn, use feeding mechanisms and cartridge designs that Spencer pioneered. Oliver Winchester profits from the very innovations he helped suppress. In 1887, Congress finally holds serious hearings about military procurement corruption. Spencer, now 54 years old and working as a consultant teaching other inventors, testifies about how his company was destroyed. He's not bitter exactly, but there's a weariness in his testimony that's been preserved in the congressional record. He explains how Winchester used bribery to influence Ordnance Department decisions, how competitors spread false reports about Spencer rifle failures, how political connections mattered more than battlefield effectiveness. And then he does something remarkable. He lists battles where Spencer rifles made the difference: Chickamauga, Hoover's Gap, the Wilderness. He calculates, conservatively, that Spencer-equipped units suffered 30% fewer casualties than traditionally armed units in comparable engagements. Then he extrapolates. If the entire Union Army had been equipped with Spencer rifles by 1863, the war probably ends a year earlier. That's tens of thousands of lives saved on both sides, hundreds of thousands of casualties prevented. The congressmen thank him for his testimony. Nothing changes. Spencer lives another 35 years, dying in 1922 at the age of 88. He never becomes wealthy. His name doesn't appear on the rifles that used his innovations. He watches as America enters World War I with institutional military dysfunction eerily similar to what he fought against. Machine guns, proven devastating in the Russo-Japanese War and early months of European fighting, get adopted slowly by American forces. Body armor, shown effective in limited trials, gets rejected as too expensive and cumbersome. The pattern repeats, and it keeps repeating. At Pearl Harbor in 1941, American forces are caught unprepared despite clear intelligence warnings because institutional arrogance assumed Japan couldn't execute sophisticated carrier operations. In Vietnam, the M16 rifle initially deployed to troops suffered from jamming problems because the Army changed powder specifications without adequate testing, and soldiers died clearing stuck cartridges just like Custer's men did 90 years earlier. In Iraq and Afghanistan, troops initially deployed without adequate body armor and armored vehicles because procurement systems were optimized for conventional warfare against state actors, not counterinsurgency against asymmetric threats. The thread connecting these failures is institutional resistance to innovation combined with bureaucratic self-protection. Every time, field commanders see problems and propose solutions. Every time, procurement officials cite budget concerns, supply chain complications, or doctrinal objections. Every time, disaster. Forces rushed reforms. And every time, the fundamental institutional culture that created the problem survives unchanged. Modern archaeologists still find Spencer rifle cartridges at Civil War battlefields. Each brass casing represents 7 shots that helped end slavery, fired by soldiers who mortgaged their farms to buy weapons their government wouldn't provide. The archaeologists find these cartridges preserved in dirt that hasn't been disturbed in over 150 years. Small brass testimonies to innovation fighting against institutional inertia, but they also represent something darker. Every Spencer cartridge found at Gettysburg or Chickamauga makes you think about the Springfield cartridges scattered across Last Stand Hill. Each one represents a shot that should have been 7 shots. Each jammed casing represents a soldier who died because bureaucrats saved $40. Christopher Spencer's gravestone in Hartford is simple. It lists his birth and death dates, nothing about his rifle or his patents or his battles with the Ordnance Department. But his real monument is more subtle and more damning. It's the pattern that repeats through American military history whenever institutional pride matters more than soldier survival. whenever budget concerns override tactical effectiveness, whenever the people making procurement decisions never have to face the consequences of their choices on the battlefield, we tell ourselves, we've learned these lessons. We create oversight committees and reform procurement processes, and promise that next time will be different. But the pattern suggests otherwise. From Spencer's repeating rifle to modern military innovation, the institution protects itself first and adapts only after blood forces change. The question isn't whether we've learned the lessons of Little Bighorn. The question is whether we're capable of learning them, or whether every generation of soldiers has to pay the same price for institutional dysfunction that Christopher Spencer spent his life fighting against. Those brass cartridges scattered across Civil War battlefields and Montana hillsides, they're not just archaeological artifacts, they're warnings we keep ignoring.